as this is our last one for the year, can I wish you all a Merry Christmas and reiterate why are we all still here. I am very aware, of course, many people will be moving into Christmas mode. That doesn't stop Cabinet from continuing to plough on with our busy agenda. This week we are announcing, together alongside Minister Shaw, the first steps towards a Zero Carbon Act. Cabinet has agreed a process of consultation through the 2018 year to help draft the legislation that will eventually come before Parliament. We will also use that process to talk about the role of an independent climate commission. We acknowledge, though, that there is a lot of work to be done, which is why an interim commission will be established in order to start preparing advice for the government. Our aim is to have the bill introduced by October 2018. I'll hand over to the Minister to give a few other introductory comments.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Good afternoon. So by the end of this Parliament, our goal is to have put in place the framework that will guide our economy towards a net zero emissions economy by the year 2050. And as the Prime Minister said, today Cabinet agreed a process by which we will develop that framework with all New Zealanders, communities, unions and business. So over the next year, we'll develop the Zero Carbon Act, which will set the new ambitious emissions reduction target for 2050. We'll establish the Independent Climate Commission to hold governments to account for meeting those budgets, and we'll coordinate the public sector around our climate change goals. I understand the Prime Minister's got a few other things to announce, so we'll be taking some questions about the detail of it towards the end.
Just to give you, thank you Minister, just to give you a further indication of the things we'll be progressing this week before Parliament rises, we will be introducing into the House a bill on medicinal cannabis. There will be further progress on our 100-day commitments around the minimum wage. We will have the first reading of the foreign buyer ban legislation, and there will be further Pike River announcements which relate to appointments to progressing that piece of work. Christmas. Just because you may or may not be interested, I will be heading to Gisborne for Christmas this year to spend with my family and Clark's family. I'll be spending a brief amount of time in Australia. That means that the acting Prime Minister from the 31st to the 3rd of January will be Winston Peters, our Deputy Prime Minister, and then from the 3rd to the 6th, because some of our ministers will be otherwise engaged in an event for one of our Cabinet Ministers, the acting Prime Minister will be Grant Robertson. Any questions? I will be prioritising those questions that have festive cheer.
For those in
Andrea.
support of medicinal cannabis,
Yes.
Can you just explain what the bill will say tomorrow?
No, not until the bill is announced by the Minister. So I'll leave him to make that announcement and to leave and to share those details.
What about the minimum wage commitments? What are those?
Yeah, as we've already indicated, as a government supported obviously by the Green Party and New Zealand First Party, we are looking to increase the minimum wage to $16.50 from April. Of course, we have a wider commitment to move incrementally by April 2021 to $20. This is the first move along that path.
Did you receive any advice from MB today about the minimum wage increase?
That would be a question for the Minister. Keeping in mind, of course, this is a decision that goes through a different process through Order in Council for minimum wage.
Arguably, in the spirit of Christmas, the Australians have abandoned legislation which see Kiwi students pay more to go to university, broadly because they weren't going to pass the Senate anyway. But what do you make of the fact that the government is now not pursuing these changes?
Oh, look, regardless of what has finally led to that final outcome, it's certainly very pleasing from this government's perspective that we will see New Zealand students in Australia continue to be able to access tertiary education over there in the same way that they have in the past.
Do you have a heads up from the Australian government?
Yes, I did receive a message from the Prime Minister to indicate that that was the outcome.
When was that?
Oh, a few days ago.
In terms of the Climate Commission, I mean, how can the government continue to give grants to mining when you've got a commission that's looking at long-term plans for climate change?
Yeah, look, we've always been really clear. We do as a nation need to transition. What we've had in our first few weeks are a couple of issues come to us where we've realised we've actually, as a government, have no discretion on some of the decisions that we've had put before us to take into account things like environmental impacts. That's something we want to change. More broadly though, we have said we need to transition. Our future isn't in fossil fuels, but this is going to take us some time. As a starting point, we have of course said we want to stop all mining, future mining on the conservation estate.
Do you expect this commission to look at that area of mining?
Oh look, no doubt, they are going to undertake things like carbon budgeting, which will give us a good steer of what it will take to reach our goals. Minister, do you want to say anything further on that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of the Zero Carbon Act and the Independent Climate Commission is to provide a long-term pathway and some, I guess, assurance to industry, no matter which industry they're in, what that pathway is, because for the last couple of decades there's been a real lack of clarity there, and it's meant that people have been in quite an unstable environment in which to invest. So we'll be able to provide that level of clarity for industry. And it will be looking at all sectors and saying, well, how can we reduce our emissions? But not just how can we reduce them, how can we also prepare for the future and ensure that as we do transition, that people end up with jobs that are actually better than the ones they've got now, that pay better than the ones that they do now.
Are you transitioning fast enough, do you think?
We've got a pretty steep curve if we're going to hit net zero by 2050, but I mean that's true of the whole planet, right? I mean we've been talking about this for a number of decades. I think everyone, not just New Zealand, all around the world is waking up to the reality that it's time for a little less conversation, a little more action.
How are you going to hit that target though in 2050 if the economy continues to rely on agriculture? It's just not realistic, is it?
Oh, well, I would say that there's a lot of room for us within the agricultural frame for us to make good technological advancements. We're seeing that, for instance, even the type of feed that you use, the way you graze, can make a difference to our emissions profile. The issue we have is making sure that we are undertaking that research, that we are at the front of the pack when it comes to making those advancements, which is why we've always indicated that having a comprehensive regime is one way that we can incentivise that work and that research being undertaken.
So how is the government going to encourage that science along? Because I know the national government talked about this for about for the entire time they were in government, but not much progress was actually made in science.
Yeah, and that's something that the Climate Commission, as we start budgeting, creating carbon budgets and really see what it's going to take for us to reach our goals, how much we'll have to reduce down our emissions by in different areas, that really will, I think, start propelling some of that work. We've also talked about phasing in agriculture into our emissions trading scheme. That's the point where we really would have a game changer in the way that we deal with these issues. But also it means that we start looking seriously at mitigation around planting of trees in order to offset some of those costs as well.
Do you have any idea?
When the National Party announced predator-free 2050, the Green Party called it lip service because the target was so far away. What's different about this target?
We called it lip service because they didn't put any money into it. So we're a big believer in becoming a predator-free country and all of the co-benefits that would have that came alongside it. But the amount of funding that went into it was absolutely anemic. And so, what we said is that actually if you're serious about that target, that you actually need to fund it properly.
So this target will be fully properly funded?
Well, this is, about the whole economy, right? So this is a transition plan over the course of the next 30 years that covers pretty much every sector that we've got. And so, as the Prime Minister said, we need to have transition plans in place for all of those sectors. Some of those are further ahead, some of them we're just getting out of the gate. And in answer to Andrea's sort of previous point about agriculture, part of the reason why we're setting up the Interim Commission is to do some of the background work and research that's required to build on the work that's been happening over the course of the last few years, but also to expand it out to other areas.
Okay.
So that by the time we get around to that decision-making point, we've got the research base that we need.
If you're not introducing the bill until October next year, what's going to take so long?
Well, there's quite a lot of economic research that we have to do that relates to kind of all right across the economy. The last set of macroeconomic research that we did wasn't done, hasn't been redone since about 2013, 2014, about then. And even then it was a sort of a once-over lightly approach. It had very narrow parameters and made a number of assumptions that were kind of wildly incorrect. And so actually all of that work has to be updated. We want to make sure that when we introduce the Act, that it's based on really solid evidence, and that we've had good consultation right across the economy, and particularly with key stakeholders in business, in the unions, with communities and so on.
It doesn't mean that all of our ambition around climate change goes on hold while the legislation is being drafted. We have, for instance, an ambition to move to 100% renewable energy generation by 2035. We have to make sure that we continue to make progress on that, and things like our commitments around tree planting, all of that continues.
Will it be to the Interim Commission, will they be the ones that decide whether or not to include agriculture into the ETS?
They will do some groundwork, but of course we've said the Climate Commission ultimately makes those decisions, but we want them to get a head start.
When do you think that decision's going to come?
Oh look, that's for the Climate Commission to establish. As we've said, we'll get them underway so that they can start some of that work. And their work goes well beyond just that question, though, of course.
Are you hoping that you can make this a non-partisan process
Yes.
to get the opposition on board and to make it an independent commission that doesn't just get wiped out when there's a change of government?
Yeah, look, as I think I've said before, there are two issues where I hope that we're able to build broad consensus around goals going forward. And our legislative framework on how to tackle them. The first was child poverty. I still have that ambition that we might get cross-party support for that, and the second is climate change. We cannot, every election cycle, every time there's a change of government, have another conversation around climate change, when actually it's got to be less about a conversation on target setting and moving on to establishing what our action plan is and sticking to it.
Yeah, Bernard, that's one of the reasons why we're taking our time, because not only do we need that evidence base, but we want to make sure that our process is really thorough and that we've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's and included the opposition, we've included business, we've included farmers in the agricultural community, that we've included the energy companies and the communities where they operate, to make sure that they feel that they've been a part of that process before we even introduce the legislation.
So why are you setting up an interim commission?
So that's simply an issue of timing. So because we have said that the Commission will make a couple of decisions in relation to how agriculture relates to the emissions trading scheme in terms of the transition plan for the 100% renewable electricity target, that work needs to start in order for us to get it done by the time we actually finish this Parliament. So as the Prime Minister said, we want that work to be underway. And then once the Zero Carbon Act passes in the first half of 2019, that work will have largely been done, and it can pass that work onto the new Commission for it to make any decisions. So it will, so the new Commission will be making the decisions, but it will be able to do so with the benefit of having sort of 12 to 18 months worth of background work already done.
So when do you expect to set up and name that commission, that interim?
Probably about March, April next year.
Just on medicinal cannabis, have you told the Greens what the contents of that legislation will be, and do you think it will go as far as they would like around cultivation?
So Nick, it's not a matter of telling the Greens. They're our confidence and supply partner. We've had conversations alongside them in the development of this legislation. So yes, they have been involved, as has New Zealand First.
And does it go as far as they would have liked around cultivation?
Oh look, what we will be producing is what we have enough support in the House to pass. There is of course another bill before Parliament that also exists, and I understand that members will have other options in that regard, but what we are producing is a bill that we know has the support of the House to get through.
And will the other bill progress? You're not going to withdraw that other bill?
No, it's a members' bill. So in the name of Chloe Swarbrick, of course, it was drafted by Julianne Genter and then was drawn just before the election. So that, as the Prime Minister said, that'll be in there as an option. But the good news is that we know that there is also a government bill that is, that has the numbers to pass the House. If we can also get the numbers for the other bill, well, that's great.
Isn't that just a big waste of time?
No, not at all, because we've undertaken that we would improve on the status quo, and we're doing that, and we can guarantee with the bill that we've got the ability to do that. We can't guarantee that with a members' bill.
So the members' bill is quite different from the one?
There are differences, and you'll see that when the bill is introduced.
BM on the foreign home buy the ban, we saw in the paper today that Treasury said that there might be some suboptimal or unintended consequences of this bill, and there's only low evidence of it actually reducing house prices. Are you confident that you won't have unintended consequences and you will reduce house prices?
Yeah, well look, I can only base that assumption on the data that's available, and we've often talked about the fact that the data is incomplete. It's never properly sized the issue. To the first point though, around unintended consequences, we absolutely acknowledge we have had to draft this bill quickly. And we've had to do that because in order for it to take effect successfully and not have a knock-on effect for our trade agreements, we had to have it in place before the final version of TPP 11 finishes. So yes, we would have liked more time to develop it. But if we find that trade agreement negotiation gives us a bit more time up our sleeves, we'll try and use that in select committee so that we are really able to traverse all of those issues that have been raised.
So if CPP negotiations blow out a little bit, you might be able to...
Yes,
take
yes.
more time.
If we have enough lead time to know that's happening, we'll take that extra time if we can in the select committee process.
What's the current situation with the Singaporean renegotiation around this?
Yeah, look, we've always acknowledged there that was the one agreement where we had an existing agreement that allowed Singaporean citizens to purchase in New Zealand. I'm yet to catch up with our Trade Minister around where he's got to on that issue. I intend to do that very soon.
Just on the waka jumping legislation, are the Green Party going to get anything out of that deal, given their long-standing position against that legislation?
Get anything out of that deal?
Get anything back, horse trading type scenario?
Look, my understanding is that they've supported that bill to select committee and want to make sure it's the best piece of legislation it can be.
Isn't that quite surprising for Green Party voters, given your opposition to it?
We got a number of concessions around the design of the bill that we're really happy with, and that meant that we felt that we could vote for it. And I particularly want to acknowledge the Justice Minister, Andrew Little, for working with us on that. So he was really constructive, sat down and said, well, what are your concerns about the design of that bill? We went through them and went through, I think, 3 or 4 different modifications, all of which he put into the bill.
Can you outline those concessions?
There were, this is just off the top of my head,
sometimes these discussions lead to amendments to enhance a bill rather than just calling them concessions.
Yeah, that's right. So there was one around making it reviewable. There was one around the 30-day period where the MP remains an MP and has the ability to respond, and then reinstating the provision around that the 3/4 of the caucus has to agree to the letter before it gets sent to the speaker. So I think those are the primary modifications.
But are you fundamentally happy with the principle of the bill, or are you just swallowing a dead rat here?
Well, look, there is actually an issue that this deals with, which is the one of proportionality, which under MMP, since we brought in MMP, that has kind of increased that as an important principle in our Parliament. It wasn't on our list, and of course, we have opposed it in the past. But I think with the changes to the bill that have been made, we're preserving that principle of proportionality, which is important. So it does deal with an issue that exists, and it does so in a way that we think that there are sufficient jurisprudential safeguards around. So we're okay to support it to select committee.
Does that fit with your third election principle of good governance?
Well, like I said, because the bill has been amended in ways that we feel have sufficient safeguards and that do align with the principles of natural justice, that actually, and because there is an issue to do with the retention of proportionality and the will of voters on election night, that, like I said, while it wasn't a high priority for us, actually it does fall within that boundary of what is good government, and we're happy to support it through.
Prime Minister, in terms of the America's Cup, do you think the government and Auckland Council are at a stand-up?
No. I ultimately think that the goal that we collectively share as 3 parties is to see Auckland as the host for the America's Cup. So certainly that's something that we're focused on. Of course, each party in these negotiations will have their own bottom lines. We want to make sure that we're getting best value for money for the taxpayer, that we're preserving the environment as we go, that we leave a legacy project that endures as well. So that's the negotiating position we're coming from.
Do you think it's appropriate, though, that the government insists that its option that it likes is still on the table despite the council already making its decision?
Oh, look, they've made an indicative decision, and at this stage we just want to make sure the basis on which that decision was made is as robust as possible. So the suggestion has been that there are issues around hazardous substances that need to be relocated that would be contributing to the cost of one of those options. We just want to make sure that that is absolutely correct so that we are all basing our decisions on really robust information.
So would you suggest that the council holds off looking for resource consent until you've made sure that that
Oh,
process
look,
is
there are
as
options,
fast?
dual consenting. We, of course, for us at the moment, it's about keeping those options open while we continue to negotiate.
On a
Prime Minister,
slightly
principally-
different note, in terms of the stadium, would the government support or give any financial, any money towards the stadium?
It would be very premature for me to comment on that at this point.
Prime Minister, the principal of Puanui School in Auckland last year was given a $8,500 ride-on lawnmower as a farewell present. And there've been a number of other principals in schools in Auckland that have been given similar departing gifts. Is that acceptable?
I would say unless that ride-on lawnmower was given to him so he could chop the fields of that school, I would be very surprised by that. It's not something I've been briefed on though, Lloyd.
The Auditor General's just released a report on it. And there's a plethora of schools that have had
Yeah.
questionable spending over the years for overseas trips and on gifts for principals that range, from a couple of grand up to $10,000. So
I would find, given the environment that our schools are operating in, I would probably take a similar view to probably the parents of those schools and find that very surprising. I'll look at the Auditor General's report.
yeah, one Kuta spent nearly $250,000 going to Rarotonga.
Yes, as I say, I would find that hugely surprising given the environment our schools are operating in, and schools, particularly parents who are paying donations, I think would also be surprised by that kind of spending, and I'll undertake to look at that report.
Did Cabinet consider the tax working group make-up to that?
Oh, not at today's meeting, but there is likely to be announcements on that forthcoming in the very near future.
Did Cabinet discuss
I'm not going to necessarily get into the individual ins and outs of every cabinet conversation, you understand.
Did Cabinet discuss the purchase of 4 Boeing Poseidon aircraft to replace the Orion fleet?
As I say, I don't tend to get into the ins and outs of every conversation. At the point that we announce something, we announce it. You will notice, though, that most of our agenda has been dominated by the 100-day plan.
On the 100-day plan, the plan does set out, quote, to set the zero carbon emission